we're starting this morning with the Mishnah on Chaf Vav Amid Beis, about 2/3 down. That will be the start point. But before we get started, I would like to go back to a question that we had a couple of weeks ago, which I researched and found the question, Menashe. So I just want to quickly review the question, which was, if we want to go back to Daf Chaf Daled Amid Beis, the Mishnah Chaf Daled Amid Beis talked about finding something behind a fence or a stone wall, and the Mishnah there advises us that you should not move it, that's someone's particularly put it there, and since and we're assuming there is no siman, if you move it away, he's not going to be able to, and you say, I found something behind the stone fence. What is it? And he's not going to be able to give you a siman, because let's say he found something that was more generic, but it was hidden there. So the makom is what's going to generate it. So the Mishnah tells us the halacha is don't touch it, just leave it alone, and the person will come back for it. Because once you take it, as the Gemara concludes, now you can no longer return it, and you announcing it won't help. So you're gonna have to hold it till the El Yonavi. So Menashe, the question then came up. Menashe, you asked the question. Well, there's a mitzvah of Shabbos Haveda, and particularly if something, let's say you put something down there, and that object may get destroyed, or something may happen to that object. If you leave it there, so now you're faced with the dilemma of leaving it there, and something may happen to the object. In other words, let's say rain or whatever it happens to be, some natural maybe phenomena, or taking it and trying to return it. So basically, you're stuck between two issues, and although we didn't articulate it, but then you become a shomer chinam. In other words, if you take it and hold on to it, you become a shomer chinam. So what are your obligations? So there is no halacha on it. And as I tried searching through the Shilos and Shuvas, no one really touched on that kind of dilemma as to what you do in that circumstance. Because the Mishnah, which we take as halacha, although it isn't codified as such, says you shouldn't touch it. You shouldn't take it, because that's the only way that person is going to come back and get it. He has no other means of identifying the object. So it seems to me that the logical thing to do is protect it, cover it up. I mean, if you know that something is there that's going to get damaged, do the best you can to protect the item. That much you can do, because remember, the mammon of your chaver is dear to him, and it should be dear to you. So you shouldn't just say, okay, it doesn't matter, it'll get washed away. But that's the most you can do, because if you do anything more, then you'll upset this halacha, because then he'll never get it back, so to speak, because he'll never find it, and he won't be able to identify it. So it seems to me in that situation where you have that kind of quandary, you do your best to protect the item, and then that's the mitzvah. I mean, that's all you can do. Now you were not over loisa salem or whatever. I mean, you couldn't return it because you didn't know to return it to. So then you're supposed to just leave it. Maybe if you come back after a long while, it isn't taken. Maybe there is a different circumstance. You can say it was hefker. But certainly, if you go by it and you don't know exactly when it was put there, you have an achrayus not to touch it. So that, I think, is from a sensical point of view, the best answer, because there's no, so to speak, direct response to this kind of a question. So I think that's kind of where we have to leave that and say that the Mishnah telling us the halacha, and then we have to work around the halacha if there's something to protect it as best as we can. Okay, that's
Rabbi, excuse me, Jonathan. Yeah. Do you have a any dedications? I don't hear you. You're muted. You're still muted.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Refuah Shalema for Maryasha Meta Bat Risha Miriam. My sister-in-law.
Yeah.
Okay. Refuah Shalema. And also good morning to Tzvi, who's on the channel. Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay. All right. So now we're going to go back to where we would pick up at Chav Vav Amud Beis, the Mishnah. Another interesting Mishnah and a twist on some of the halachas that we have for returning lost objects. Okay, so the Mishnah tells us, Motza b'chanus. If you go into a store, any store, and you find an object on the floor, harei shelo. It belongs to you. You don't have to return it because there is no assumption here that it belongs to the owner or anything else. There's no particular thing unusual about what you find, so it belongs to you. However, ben hateva lechenveni, if it's between the teva, they call it the counter, and the chenveni, and the storekeeper, shel chenveni, it belongs to the chenveni. Now, take a look at Rashi, because this is a different circumstance than what you might think ben teva lechenveni. We might think that you come up to the counter, the man is standing behind the counter, so anything behind the counter belongs to the store owner. Well, that's of course true, but that's not what the Mishnah is telling us. So let's take a look at the Mishnah. Rashi. Motza b'chanus harei shelo, b'davar she'ein bo simin, koi, we're talking about something that has no simin. The nafel minei miyayish hakol nichnasim l'sham. Whoever would have dropped it would have been miyayish, he would have given up, because everybody walks around there. So there's no chance that he will find it. So that's the general rule. Now, bein hateva. So listen to this. Shahachenveni yoshev lifoneho. So you have a counter, and you have a store owner who sits in front of the counter. V'tamid notel mimena, and he turns around when someone wants to buy something. He turns around and takes it off the counter of v'nosel lefanov umocher. So the counter is behind him, and it's filled with all kinds of objects. And someone says, "I'd like that," whatever it is. So the chenveni who's sitting in front turns around, picks up the item, and sells it to him. Umo shenosalo nosal teva, and the money that he gives him, he puts onto the counter, which is behind him. Lo nafel shum davar elam yad chenveni. So anything that would have fallen there would have fallen from the chenveni because it's behind him. So it's a little bit of an unusual circumstance where he takes the objects, takes the money, puts the money behind him. So therefore, any money found behind the store owner belongs to the store owner, right? So we got a different picture of what it looks like.
So
Now-
a question. In terms of in general, that if it's not between the store owner and his table or whatever, that you can take it. It sounds to me like this is not like you walk into Shalom's and you have the cash register at the front, which would be like the Kanvani and his table sort of close enough to that, but rather that but then the rest of it is this open area, but it's really all the store. If you find something in Shalom, normally I would think, number one, if it's anything that's sold elsewhere in the store, even if it's not in the place where it is, you would assume that it's the stores. And if it's something that's not something sold by that store, you take it, people would remember maybe that they lost it in that store. It sounds like this might be more of like an open marketplace where you have these stalls all around, and so that Bachanut is really not in a store, but all around.
That's not what
Well,
the
so
text says.
that's why I'm
okay?
asking.
Let's just face it, we're more honest than they were back then. Then if you found something in Giant or in Shalom, you just pocket it. Okay, we're better than that.
No, I don't know about that. Maybe, but I'm just wondering if maybe they didn't have that if you have, and there are marketplaces like this.
Why are you being
We're not talking
malicious?
about something that you can identify and say, "Oh, it belongs to Shalom's," or it belongs
No,
to
but what? But the extreme case, you go to a department store. They literally sell everything in that place. Okay, Target. You've got clothes, you've got food, you've got gadgets, you name it. So almost anything, so to speak, that you find in that store, unless it's a personal item with a simon, is probably something that's sold somewhere in that store. So the default, I would assume, is that it came from that store, as opposed to if I'm in an open air market and I've got all these stalls all around. yeah, there might be one on the other side that sells the same kind of item that I found, but I wouldn't have any assumption that it came from that unless it was literally right in front of that stall, which is the case with the Panvani here.
Right. Okay. So clearly, what the Gemara is talking about is the latter example, not the former, because I don't think they had department stores. In a department store, if you find something on the ground, again, I assume in most department stores, maybe not everything, a lot of the items have some kind of a siman that it belongs to the store, whether it's some kind of
So you might still have a tag on it.
a tag or something like that, right? So clearly, if you're walking the aisle and you see a pair of pants on the floor, you're not going to assume that someone dropped it and it's hefker. That there's a logical assumption there. But we're taking the department store example out of the picture. You're right. We're talking about open market. You've got stalls. You've got all kinds of things going on. There's people walking and going and coming. And you walk along and you find something on the ground, whether it's money or something else that clearly is generic. What do you do? So the Mishnah is telling us that if you find it in the store, so to speak, let's say the marketplace, okay, you find it in the marketplace, in the store, and it's around, okay, it could be from anybody. And the person, if he lost it, Mistama will be miyayish right away, because you go to Machne Yehuda, you're not going to find it. It's somewhere. Now, if you go, maybe Machne Yehuda is a good example, because in Machne Yehuda you have all these stalls. So in most cases in Machne Yehuda, we know that the storekeeper sits behind the counter. In other words, we've got a whole counter of different food items, and you can you buy it and you give him the money. So clearly, if you found money behind the table where he sits, there's no question. The Mishnah's example is where you had a storekeeper who had a counter, but he sat in front of the counter. And we see that, by the way, in markets, that there's someone sitting in front and you come over, maybe it's not a food vendor, maybe it's some kind of a trinket vendor, or who knows. And then you say, oh, I'd like that dreidel for Hanukkah. So he says, sure. And he turns around, takes the dreidel from the table behind him and gives you the dreidel, and you give him the money. Now, the money that's found behind where the storekeeper sits, somewhere there, if it falls and someone sees it, they can't say, oh, there's money over there on the floor. It's certainly hefker because someone dropped it, because it is between the storekeeper, as the Mishnah says, ben hatevo lechenveni shel chenveni. So in all likelihood, the chenveni, where he was sitting, he dropped it because people don't go there. They go in front of the storekeeper, but not behind. So that's that circumstance. Now it goes on the Mishnah and says a second example, shulchani. What's a shulchani? So Rashi says machlef mos. It's a money changer. So there's a table. He sits behind the table in the normal sense. So they give him the money. He sits there behind the table and he gives them the exchange. So says the Mishnah, shulchani, lifnei ha-shulchani harei shalom. If the money was found in front of the shulchani, it belongs to the finder. Shulchani, the shulchani. But if the money was sitting on the table where the money changer makes his business, it belongs. Between the chair and the shulchani, and this is the traditional table, and then the shulchani sits behind the table. So if you find it on the floor between the seat where the shulchani was sitting and the shulchani, it belongs to the shulchani because it's behind the table. So clearly he would have dropped the money and it belongs to him.
Excuse me, Rabbi.
Yeah.
Rabbi, I remember in Machane Yehuda, many of the vendors are sitting on the side of the merchandise closer to the people that are walking by because they try and make it a personal thing.
Right.
And here we don't.
So that would be an example of the chenveni where he's sitting kind of in front of, or not behind the counter, but in front.
Yeah. He's
front
sitting with the materials, and he just either has the money himself in his pocket in terms of taking the money and handing the item to the person walking by.
Right,
He reaches back, but quite often, from what I remember, the most of the vendors there want to be close to the people, so they stand as close to the aisle as they can.
right. So
Unless-
if that money is sitting somewhere where the chenveni is sitting closer to the table, right, then we say it belongs to the chenveni because he must have dropped it as he was.
Putting it in or something.
Right, right.
Although there are exceptions where they have such booming voices, they don't have to sit anywhere near the people, like the guy at the strawberry.
Right, right, right. So they're all over the place. Right, right. But these are classic examples of what the Mishnah is talking about because that's the way business was conducted.
Yeah.
So they either sat, depending on what you were. I mean, like a money changer. We can imagine a money changer really wouldn't be sitting in front of the table. He'd be sitting behind the table. You come up, you give him $1, right? And that's when we change money in Israel or anywhere else. That's what usually happens. You give him the money, he gives it to you. If it's in front of the booth, clearly it belongs to the finder because whoever had lost it was miyayish. He doesn't know, he's miyayish. But if it's somewhere behind the table, then and I'm saying behind the table very specifically because you're going to see in the very beginning of the Gemara that we have a question about that. So, but if it's behind the table, then it belongs to the shulchani, to the money changer.
I think in the Shuk HaCarmel in Tel Aviv, you'll find many more merchants standing behind their counters. It's spread out more and whatever.
Right.
But in the money changers, especially at least the ones in Jerusalem, they have a counter
Yeah.
and they have the money is in a wall behind what that they're sitting in front of, and they have a cash register. They take the money from the wall and put it in a cash register to count it and dispense it to you.
So Jonathan, you're talking about a money changer.
Right.
Maybe
Modern.
that's now the more sophisticated. I remember, and maybe it still exists, if you would go into the old city, especially maybe in the Arab quarter, but if you went through Shar Shem or whatever, there would be money changers sitting there behind a table. They literally would be there. In other words, they didn't have holes in the wall where they were, counters and anything like that. I'm talking years ago. You walked through the shuk, and there was a guy sitting behind a table right in the middle of the alley as you're walking by, and he was exchanging money. So that's the more classic case of this Mishnah. He's got a table. He's sitting behind the table. There are hordes of people walking back and forth, and you go to the table. You give him the money, he exchanges. Now, if for some reason there's a coin sitting behind the table where he's sitting, we automatically assume it's his because he made the exchange and dropped the coin. If it's in front of the table where the hordes of people are walking, forget about it. That's already belongs to the Oived, I mean, whoever finds it, because there it's impossible to determine who it is. And we're saying that clearly was Yish. He doesn't even have to announce it. So that's what this Mishnah is giving us, two distinct kinds of situations of a money changer and a storekeeper.
One thing I put a link in the chat. There was a story a week ago. This happened in the U.S. where an armored truck was driving along, and
I heard that. Yeah,
the door came open, and money started flying out, and people start grabbing it. And they actually arrested some people, and they put out appeals saying, "Look, you're gonna if we catch you from a video or whatever, you will be prosecuted for it." So this,
but that's outright Geneva,
right? The point being that here it's a situation where people think, we say, oh, are people more honest? No, they're not more honest on average. Some people are, some people aren't, because here it is a situation where people think, oh, well, if the money's out there flying around, I can take it even though they know 100% where it came from and therefore where it needs to go.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there was no child. There was no question where it came from. All of that money came from the truck. There was no yiush, and so you have an achrayus to return it. There, you're right. That's 100%. It's not even, it's gezela, it's broad daylight, right? It's gezela. Now, says the Mishnah, halakech peres mechavero, if someone goes to a fruit vendor and buys peres from his friend, or shesholach lo chavero peres, or someone sends him peres as a gift, and he finds money in the sack, even though you know who sent it, we'll get to that in a minute, you know who sent it, and you know where you bought it. So you would think maybe that you should go back to that person. Says the Mishnah, Hara'elu Shalom. In Hoya Tzurin, if it was, however, bundled up, then that's already a siman. Notel Machris, then he has to announce, because that's not usual anymore. So let's look at Rashi. Hara'elu Shalom. The Amina min haborim naflusha harei shulchan mafsik. Oh, okay, this is from the previous thing. We say min haborim naflu, it fell from the people who came. Shaharei shulchan mafsik ben shulchan lamos. The money changer's table is between him and the Shenimtzu. The imin hashulchani nafel oyalehem lahamtzi beino lekise shashulchan munach olav. So that's the classic case where you sit behind the table. Anything behind the table is yours. Anything in front of the table belongs to whoever finds it. Al-Keach Peres Mechaveru Mefarish B'Gemara, right? And Hoya Tzrurin, or your siman, or kesher, or minyan shebehem. In other words, then now you're already talking about a siman because it was tied up, maybe in a bow or in a knot, whatever. That you have to return. So the Mishnah is giving us sort of a clear picture. But the first part of the Mishnah is what we're going to deal with right now is the chilek between what happens with a chenveni and what happens with a shulchan, with a money changer, because there are different positioning of the table. Says the Gemara, Omar Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer comes and makes the following statement: Afilu menachem al gabe shulchan. Okay, what happens? You find money on the table. On the table, what happens? Who does it belong to? So now, maybe first reaction is, well, if it's on the table, maybe it should belong to the storekeeper because it's on the table.
Why is that such a strange question to?
Because
table,
the Mishnah doesn't address it. The Mishnah only addresses if you find something on the ground between, either in front of the chenveni or the shulchani or behind him. What happens if it's on the shulchan?
Wouldn't it have been obvious if it's on the table, it's his table, it's not on the floor? I mean, it's a big, obviously it's a big, I'm missing something here, but it sounded like a very simple kind of question. Just because it was absent from the Mishnah, you certainly could assume from what we learned in the Mishnah that if something's found on the table, that's his work table, then it belongs to him.
Okay, valid thought. Now hold the thought. Now let's look at what the Gemara tells us why the Mishnah doesn't, why you can't bring a raya from this Mishnah. You're 100% right, Jay. The Chayra, we should be able to answer that from our Mishnah. Now,
Right.
now let's go see what happens. Tanan.
I was wrong, but I didn't know.
No. I mean, it's the classic. Yeah, right. So Tanan, we learned in our Mishnah. What do we say? Lifnei shulchani hari'elu shalo. If it's found in front of the shulchani, it belongs to the finder, right? Or al gabe shulchan the shulchani, but l'chayra, if it's on the shulchan of the shulchani, it should belong to the shulchani, logically. So, and that's not what Rabbi Eliezer says. Rabbi Eliezer says if it's found on the shulchan, it belongs to the finder. So from the first, if you go by the shulchani, we see that the language of the Mishnah is very clear. Lifnei hashulchan, lifnei shulchani, hari'elu shalom. If it's in front of the shulchani, it belongs to the finder. However, ala gabe shulchan, the shulchani, but on the table, it should belong to the shulchani, like you just said. So that's against Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer can't bring a raya from that because he is saying the opposite. Rabbi Eliezer is saying that if it's found on the table, it belongs to the finder. Where is the source of that? It can't be from this case of the shulchani, because we definitely extrapolate from that it has to belong to the shulchani if it's on the table. Okay, fine.
Rabbi, usually, especially in foreign countries, every time I'll go to change money, they're going to take it in their hand first. First of all, they look to see if it's real. Then they put it down They count out the difference, the currency, and they hand it to you. So
Right.
if it's on the table, it should be, if you find the actual cash that you're cashing in, should belong to the person who's sitting there.
To the
not
shulchani,
the
to the
merchant.
shulchani, right. But
Right.
Rabbi Lezer just got through saying no, that if it's on the shulchan, it belongs to the finder. Where does he get, what's the source of his learning that it belongs to the finder if it's on the table? You're right, David. You just said, and what Jay said is right. It belongs to the shulchani. It's on the table, it belongs to the shulchani. That's what this,
No, it doesn't. If it's on the table, it belongs to the person that's cashing it in. Because if I'm giving you $5 to cash in for lira or, a shekels, I give you the $5. You're gonna take that $5, look it over to see if it's real, if it's got any
right.
counterfeit, then you're gonna put it down on your table or put it away, count out the
And
exchange,
give him the money.
and then put it down on the table. Now you
Okay.
count.
Okay, so let's stop right when he examined the bill. It's all a kosher $5 bill. He gave the guy $5. Now that bill is sitting on the table. And everybody, and a wind comes and starts blowing that bill. And the finder, and someone says, oh, it's on the table. And he picks it up as the wind is blowing it. Rabbi Lezer says it belongs to the finder. Rabbi Lezer says it belongs to the finder. And yet you're positing a situation. You're positing a situation.
Normal procedure is they take that money. If you're doing it on the street with somebody, he takes it, wraps it up, puts it in his money wad, and then he gives you the money.
The man
Nobody's
is still
seen-
there.
Huh?
When the finder's a third person, but the second person, the one who's trying to change the money, he's standing right next to the one who says, I found it.
Right, there are three parties here.
Yeah.
Right.
But then
The
one of
three
them's
parties,
lying.
three parties
But
here.
not the money exchanger, because the money exchanger is gonna have that money in his pocket. He's not gonna give out. Now, if it's the dollars and not the currency that you're exchanging for, then okay, then you can understand that it's the merchant. I mean, it's the owners.
But
But if
how can a finder come along and say, I just found this, when the man who's
No,
doing the exchange,
it blew
right
off the
there.
table. The coins are now found on the ground, not on the table.
right,
But they were on the table and now, right, they were on the table.
but the customer who came to change the money will tell this finder, no, stop a second, that's my money. I'm in the middle of an exchange. How can you dare you come in and say, I found it?
So we're trying to find out what is Rabbi Lezer's source of saying afilu menachem al gabe shulchan, it belongs to the finder. That's his pronouncement. He says that.
But what's the assumption about is the customer still there next to him? He must have had some assumption when he said what he said.
Okay, so you know what? The customer put it down and the finder wasn't there. So the customer put it down, it was an exchange. Let's say, hypothetically, the money changer gave him the money and he walks away and then the money flies off the table and is on the ground, was put onto the table and he finds it. So now the question is, who does it belong to? The Mishnah says it belongs to the shulchani, to the money changer. Rabbi Lezer says, no, it belongs to the finder. So clearly Rabbi Lezer can't learn it from this Mishnah because the Mishnah says, like you said, it belongs to the shulchani. How does Rabbi Lezer come along and say it belongs to the finder? Where does he get that chutzpah to say it belongs to the finder? So let's finish the story. Let's finish the story before we go weiter. So says the Gemara, wait a minute, not so fast. Amos Seifa. Look at the Seifa of this Mishnah. Ben kisei u'shulchani, we say that between the kisei and the shulchani, it belongs to the shulchani, right? If it's the shulchani is sitting behind the table, money that's behind the table is his. Or al gabi shulchani shalo. But if it's on the table, it belongs to who? To the finder. So wait a minute. we have now a stira in this Mishnah because the second part of the Mishnah supports Rabbi Eliezer. Because Rabbi Eliezer says on the table, it belongs to the finder. And the Mishnah says if it's behind the table, it belongs to the shulchani. But we extrapolate from that if it's on the table, it doesn't belong to the shulchani. You understand? In other words, we're looking at the words of the Mishnah. And that's why I said when we were learning the Mishnah, the language is very important. Because depending on whether you're reading the ratio or the sefer of the Mishnah, you can conclude either way that the table is or is not the domain of the shulchani. According to the ratio of the Mishnah, it's definitely the domain of the shulchani. According to the sefer of the Mishnah, it is not the domain of the shulchani. So therefore, the finder it can keep it. So we have a stira in the Mishnah. So the question is, where does Rabbi Eliezer learn it from? Does he learn it from the Mishnah? How can he? There's a stira. The Mishnah says one thing, and then the Mishnah says something else. So how could where does he conclude that it belongs definitively? I mean, that it belongs to the finder. The Mishnah goes both ways, depending on which part of the Mishnah you're learning, right? I mean, that's now the question. So what we were discussing in the beginning is a very valid point everybody was making. Wait a minute. Of course it belongs to the shulchani. It's on the table and whatever. But now you look at the sefer, where the sefer says, you know what belongs to the shulchani? Only what's behind the table. What's on the table does not belong to the shulchani. In which case, then Rabbi Eliezer is right. If you find it on the table, it doesn't belong to the shulchani. It belongs to the finder. The buyer left, and the money is hanging around over there. Okay, it's my money. I found it. That's the kasha here on Rabbi Eliezer. Where does Rabbi Eliezer learn it from? Because from the Mishnah, there's conflicting answers. Okay, that's the kasha here. Where does Rabbi Eliezer get it from? The Mishnah goes both ways. Reisha says one thing, Sefer says something else. So it says the Gemara, Elamehai leka lamashma minei. You can't learn it from our Mishnah because we don't know what's right. The Rabbi Eliezer, hi manale. Where does Rabbi Eliezer know it? Okay, so now we're getting back to the source of the question. How does Rabbi Eliezer really know it if what he's saying is that it belongs to the finder and there's a stira in the Mishnah? Omar Rava, comes Rava, and he says, Mashnishin Kashise, our Mishnah is fair, there's a kasha. My area, the Tane Ben Kisei, the Shulchani, Shel Shulchani, Lisna ala Shulchan. So Rava wants to try to give an answer. So Rava wants to say as follows. Why does he's asking this in a hypothetical. Why does the Mishnah say Ben Kisei l'Shulchani Shel Shulchani, that between the seat and the table belongs to the Shulchani? What it should have said, Lisna al HaShulchan. If it's on the table, it belongs to the Shulchani. End of story. Then clearly we would know that behind the table it belongs to the Shulchani. Right? He's learning it out from a Hekesh. If you want to say that it belongs to the Shulchani, the Mishnah should have said, if it's on the table, it belongs to the Shulchani. And then we clearly would know that behind the table, because remember, the focus of the Mishnah is behind the table. And it says behind the table belongs to the Shulchani. Says Rava, if that's what you wanted to learn, then let him say outright, on the table belongs to the Shulchani. And we would know, Memela, that behind the table belongs to the Shulchani. By not saying it, says Rava, we're concluding that on the table does not belong to the Shulchani. It belongs to anybody else, in this case, the finder. So that's how Rava wants to answer, where does Rabbi Eliezer learn this from? There's a stira in the Mishnah. So he says, fine, there's a stira in the Mishnah, but the Mishnah could have very clearly stated that everything on the table and beyond belongs to the Shulchani. It didn't say that. It says specifically behind the table. So I have to conclude that anything in front of the meaning front of the shulchan on the table belongs to whoever finds it, because the Mishnah had an opportunity to say it belonged to the shulchan and didn't. That's Rava's answer. So Rava's concluding that because the Mishnah didn't say clearly it belongs to the finder. That's how Rava answers it.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
just to expand a little further on this. If a person is exchanging money, that's a monetary value that a person cherishes more than a pair of pants or a sweater. If you're sitting in the shuk and they pile up apples or fruit and it rolls off on the floor, they're not going to stop and pick it up right away. They're in the middle of a transaction. It's on the floor. It could be your next door neighbors. It could be somebody. In that respect, I could say, sure, I agree. It's whoever found it if he doesn't pick it up. But money, they're not going to put down. They've never put down money. A money changer holds on to that coin or that dollar and keeps it in his possession the full time. So, I mean, you're also talking about the older days and nowadays. Before, they didn't have a shield between you and the person. Now they put glass and you feed it underneath.
Right now it's a different story. Yeah.
But years ago, even now in certain countries, you just exchange it on the street with somebody standing there. So you don't even have a table. So how could you say that the currency that you're exchanging or somebody is exchanging belongs to the exchanger when it's left on the table, when he doesn't leave any money around on the table? If you give him the money, he puts it in his wallet immediately before he even starts counting out the money. So
I'm not sure that's correct. First of all, again, I don't know how they did it 1,000 years ago. Clearly, they may have had their own way of doing it. But isn't it a practice, or at least we see that today from what we see, is that if I give somebody a $20 bill, they don't put the $20 bill in their pocket and then start counting out money. They leave that 20 there and then finish the transaction so that there is no question that what was given is a 20 and what was returned was either money or merchandise equivalent to the 20. So the standard, I think, I believe, is that when I give you, and I want to change a $100 bill, I don't think you take the $100 bill, put it in your pocket and start giving me money, because then there could be a dispute. You give me 50 and you'll say you only gave me a $50 bill. So you would leave that bill on the table until the transaction is finished. And then both parties have to see that they got the right amount. And then he takes that 100 and puts it in his pocket, and the other guy takes the change and puts it in his pocket. So our situation is where, in all likelihood, that transaction was completed, and the recipient of the change is not in the picture, and that bill or coin, whatever it was, slipped off the table because it was found on the floor. So the question is, but if it was on the shulchan, who does it belong to? So the chayra, you would argue, the Mishnah says, well, it belongs to the money changer. Says the Gemara, then why didn't the Mishnah say so? The Mishnah could have easily have said anything on the table or behind the table belongs to the money changer. We would have no question that money belongs to the money changer. The Mishnah went out of its way to say that the money behind the table belongs to the money changer. It's silent, mind you, on the question of the money on the table. Comes Rabbi Eliezer and says, you know what? That silence means that it belongs to the finder, because the Mishnah could easily have said the money on the table and behind the table belongs to the shulchani. Says Rava, because it didn't say that, we can conclude that the money on the table doesn't belong to the money changer, because it was there for the taking and the Mishnah didn't say so. So that's the thinking of Rava. Even though there's a stira, there's a conflict between the Reisha and the Seifa, but forget about the conflict. The mere fact that the Mishnah didn't articulate that the money on the table belongs to the money changer means it doesn't belong to him. That's, in other words, in its purest sense, we can argue as many different things,
No,
David.
no, I agree with that part. I
Right.
believe that the
So
money
that-
left on the
Right,
table
so that's
belongs to the person that's given the money changer, not the money changer.
not the money changer. So that's what Rabbi is saying. From
Oh.
our Mishnah, we can learn a proof to Rabbi Eliezer, because the Mishnah did not say the table and behind. It said only behind, so it left the table open. That's one way of answering Rabbi Eliezer. Let's just go on. Inami, there's a second way of answering Rabbi Eliezer, that the source of Rabbi Eliezer's statement. Why? What does the Mishnah say? Remember, this is all based on the language of the Mishnah. And the question is, the Mishnah had an opportunity, the Tanoim could have articulated the halacha in the way they wanted to. The fact that they articulated it one way means that there was clearly something in their statement that they wanted to say definitively and not say. So we're picking through the careful words of the Tanoim and saying, you, Tana, said this, therefore you meant this and not that. So in the first case, you meant behind and not on. Inami, matzah b'shulchanos k'diktani reisha. Different question. If the Mishnah is, the Mishnah is a little bit odd, right? What does it say? Matzah b'chanus harei elu shalom. If he finds it in a store, it belongs to him, and then it talks about the storekeeper. Why didn't the second half of the Mishnah say the same thing in parallel? Why did it not say matzah b'shulchanos? If I find it in and around where the money changer is, meaning quote unquote his store, but his area, k'diktani reisha. It should have said, you know what? If I come into the area of a money changer and I find a coin sitting on the floor or something or around, it belongs to me. Just like if I come into a store and find a coin, it belongs to me. In other words, the Mishnah could have made an exact parallel of chanus and shulchanus, the storekeeper and the money changer. It didn't do that. And that's exactly how we're going to learn out, because since it didn't do that, it didn't say the parallel, so because it didn't say it in parallel, we extrapolate. So in other words, in this particular case, Rabbi Eliezer is going to say, you know what? This Mishnah should have said the same thing for Shulchanos as it said for Chenveni. It didn't. Therefore, I'm left to understand that anything that I find around the money changer is mine, right? Because it didn't say that certain things belong to the money changer. It only said what belongs to the money changer is what's behind him, not on the table or around. So it's similar but not exact to the first teretz, but basically it's telling us that the language of the Mishnah here is very exacting. Says Rabbi Eliezer, I can learn from this language that the finder is the one who gets to keep everything unless it's exactly the way the Mishnah presents it. If you wanted to present it a little different, you could have said it differently. So anyway, that's the result of that is what Rabbi Eliezer relies on. So even though the Mishnah itself has a Reish and a Sefer which are not exactly aligned, still Rabbi Eliezer learns it from the language of the Mishnah as to what the Mishnah could have said and didn't say. So let's look at Rashi. Okay, now so Rashi doesn't add on this, but this is the definitive answer here is that Rabbi Eliezer is correct, that if he finds it on the table, then depending on which read, for a variety of reasons, on the table is considered the finders and not the balabos, not the chenveni and not the shulchani. So it's an interesting, again, talking about how exact the language has to be. If it's not exact, then we can extrapolate different kinds of things because one might argue, why should it belong to the finder if it's on the store and it's on the table, and if it rolled off the table, it should belong to the storekeeper. Why should it belong to? Why should we assume that it belonged to somebody else and it was meyayish and the finder found it. That's really, the dilemma that we deal with, and that's how the Gemara answers it.
But the Tanoim, when they had their discussions, it sounds like nobody brought up the question that you have a conflict between two sides of this Mishnah. And somebody must have asked these other variations the way we're doing it here. And still they didn't change the words. They kept it the ambiguous between the right and the sefer. That's
Well,
kind of,
unless you can argue that the status of a shulchani is different than a chenveni, so in other words, the rules don't apply to one and to the other. So then maybe you could say the Mishnah is telling us two distinct different things. But from Rabbi Lezer's standpoint, when he asks the question, it's clearly a stira. In other words, in and of itself, we can accept chenveni does his thing, shulchani does his thing, no problem. But when Rabbi Lezer makes a blanket statement that anything that's found on a table belongs to the finder, he is saying that happens in the case of the chenveni and the shulchani. Then the Gemara says, wait a minute, if that's the case, then we have a stira between the Reisha and the Sefer, because the Reisha says one thing, the Sefer says something else.
I understand it. I'm just puzzled why the Tanoim left it this way when they certainly had asked the same questions we're asking here. The questions are pretty obvious.
It's pretty obvious, yeah, but it wasn't asked. In and of itself, it wasn't asked. It was only asked in the context of Rabbi Lezer saying, my situation is universally the finder. Then we say, wait a minute, now we have a stira between Reisha and Sefer. Otherwise, no one would think of a stira because they're two different types of
Scenarios.
things. Right. Okay, so let's go a little weiter. Now we're going to talk about the fruit, the peiros. The Mishnah said, "Alakeach pas mechavero," it belongs to the finder. Amar Shlakish Mishun Rabbi Yanai. Shlakish says in the name of Rabbi Yanai, Lo Shani. We don't say that this is correct. Ella. Now we're on Chav Zayin Amud Aleph, the top of Chav Zayin. We don't say that's correct. Ella belokeach min hat teger. Says Rashi. Lokeach when I take it, Afhu lokeach tavua zu me'anoshim harbe lo yedia demaninu. We given the less base siman. You see, I should abide. Okay, so now we're going to get into wholesale and retail. You go to a store and you want to buy. I go to Paris here. He means tavua. He means it could be anything, but Rashi says tavua. So you go to the store, you buy a bushel of tavua. And you come home and you find some money stuck into the bundle of tavua. What do? Well, I bought it from vendor A in the market. I should go back to vendor A and I should say, Reuven, this is your money. I found it. You gave me this bundle, and it's yours, not mine. Says the Gemara, Lo Shani. We didn't learn that you don't have to return it. Ela b'lokeach min hateger. If you buy it from someone who himself has bought it from wholesalers, there's 10 wholesalers all selling tavua to hundreds of retailers. You bought it from a retailer, but the retailer bought it from a wholesaler. The wholesaler sold him bunches of wheat. You don't know where he bought it from, which wholesaler. Says the Gemara, says the Mishnah, Alokeach. And you're talking about a teger, then you don't have to return it because clearly it came from a higher up source in the food chain and he was miyayish. So the person, the wholesaler who put that money in says, how the heck am I going to find out which retailer I gave that money to? Fine. If I buy it from a balabayis who makes up the bundles in the back of his store, he buys everything loose, and then he makes up the bundles. And in one of those bundles you find money, chayav lahachzir, because there's no confusion, there's no chance that it was that it belonged to somebody else because that particular fellow made it up in the back of his store. Okay, so that makes sense. So a Tana who was learning this sugya came to Rav Nachman, and he said, "Lo shno ela b'lokeach min hateger, aber lokeach min balabayis chayv lahachzir." So he repeated this halacha to Rav Nachman. you know what? It only applies to a tager, but not to a balabas. Right? Rab Nachman says to him, balabas ba'atzma dashan. Did the balabas thresh the tvua? I mean, you're telling me that if a balabas goes back to the balabas, says Rashi, hu atzma dashes a tvua hazos. Did he actually thresh this tvua to prepare it for to bundle it? Halopolim harbe dashu osa. Many workers worked on this. So how do you know? Why do you say it goes back to the balabas? Maybe it's one of the threshers who lost the money and it fell into this pot. And so you want to make a distinction as to whether or not you can figure out if there was yiyush. Why should it belong to the balabas? If it belonged to one of the people who threshed, he was long since miyayish. So why can't the recipient keep the money even if he bought it from a balabas, not from a tager? That's the kasha. He repeated this brisa to him, and he said, so that the person who told him over the halacha, he said, Amalei, Ismay, should I recant? In other words, did I make a mistake in saying what I said? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I should not have said that it belongs to the balabas. Maybe it doesn't belong to the balabas. Amalei, lo. He said to him, no, don't recant. Targum is Nissen, you have to learn the Mishnah to go Shadoshan al Yidei Abdo B'Shivchaso HaKnanim. So, in other words, he gave him an out. He said, you know what? This balabas has a lot of workers, non-Jewish workers, and they thresh and they work and they pack and they prepare. So even if it belonged to one of them, everything, if a person has an Evet Kanani or a Shifra Kananis, everything they own, he owns, belongs to him. So Rabbi Nachman said, don't worry about it because it really does belong to the balabas because he is the owner of all their possessions. So he gave him an out to say, you don't have to erase what you just said because it really is okay. So Rashi says, Ismay, Asya Brisa Zu Girsati, should I take this Brisa out of my Girsa because I made a mistake? It should really belong to the finder. Or Malay, low, Hasme, Tirgum, Misnissen. In other words, don't worry about it because everything that an Eved and a Shivcha Kanan is. Now, if it was a Jewish worker, an Eved Ivri, you'd have a problem. Because if it's an Eved Ivri, then you could say maybe the Eved Ivri lost it. So why should you have to give it back to the Balabas? The Balabas himself is it may not own it. It may have been belonged to the Eved Ivri, and it fell out of his pocket as he was working. And then later on, he checks his pocket and says, "Wait a minute, I don't have my money." And so clearly, he prepared 100 baskets, and they all sold. He's not getting that dollar back. So then there's years. So basically, it's an example of what the Gemara is trying to teach us is that you have to be careful when the Gemara says Alokeach Paris. You know, again, where is the Paris coming from? So if it's a chain or if it comes from people who handle it, the likelihood is that they will have been miyayish because they have no clue where that money went to which operation, and people have already long since taken.
But for the last case, weren't there contract workers, not avodim that were doing this?
Say it again. Was there what?
Weren't there some people that just hired out to do the work?
Right.
They're not avodim. It wasn't an Evid Kanani or an Evid Shifra Kanani. They were just workers, laborers who hired themselves out for the day. We have that so many places in the Gemara.
Right, but I think what the Gemara is saying here is that a balabai is not a big manufacturer. He has his own little shop, and he has people working for him. And his Eved, his Shifra. In those days, if a person had a household with non-Jewish servants, the servants did the work to prepare the business, the sale. So we're talking about a small operator, and l'chayra with a small operator, the Gemara says you should return it because we know where it came from. Says Reb Nachman, not so fast. because in all likelihood, he had servants. And again, he's assuming they're Canaanim. He said in all likelihood, he had servants, and those servants did all the work. So even if they lost the money, because the whole question was, how do you know the balabos lost the money? Maybe the workers lost the money. Teretz is, if they're non-Jewish workers, it doesn't matter. The balabos owns all their possessions anyway. So that's how he kind of answers the question. But you're right. I mean, if they're separate hired laborers, but there too, if you hire laborers and they work, that's kind of the situation of the tager. The tager is the one who's buying it from wholesalers. So substitute laborers for wholesalers. I mean, instead of buying it from wholesalers, there's all kinds of people out there who are doing the work. You have no clue who they are, what they are. So in all likelihood, there's no way of tracing that back. So therefore, you don't have, therefore the Mishnah is correct. You don't have to return the money unless you're buying it. I mean, maybe you're buying a fruit that is only one person sells. Let's say you go to Machne Yehuda and you buy an unusual fruit that only one person sells in the entire Machne Yehuda, then you know where it came from. I mean, whoever said before Tutzodeh, there must be 10 vendors screaming Tutzodeh, and everybody wants your business, and you buy it from one, maybe for half a shekel less or whatever. But if you're going to buy something that is miyuchad, that is somewhat unusual, then the likelihood is that, and you found a coin in that bundle, then Mistama, you have to return it, because that clearly came from that fellow, because there was nobody else. So you'd have to return it. So that's how the Mishnah is trying to answer this question.
Does an Eved Ivri have ownership rights as far as?
His own owner, he has his ownership rights. So for an Eved
Yes,
Ivri,
yeah.
the owner does not own the possessions of an Eved Ivri. So that's why he says, that's why he gave him an answer of
Yeah,
Eved Kanani,
Eved Kanani, yeah, right.
Eved Kanani, because he owns it anyway. So he's a small businessman. He probably owns everything that the workers made anyway. So then, okay, so that's the end. Mitzvah Next week we'll pick up Chav Zayin and Aleph from the Mishnah. I wish everybody a Freilich and Chanukah. We should have a beautiful Hanukkah. And if the Beis HaMikdash hasn't been rebuilt by next Sunday, then Mitzvah will continue on Chav Zayin and Aleph, the Mishnah.
They're going to have to open up the country to
What's
go.
that?
It's almost like Mashiach can't come this week because the country is closed.
Right.
A ridiculous statement I just made. Anyway.
All right.